There are moments in history when everything seems stable on the surface, when kingdoms appear strong, when power feels secure, when people believe they are in control of their own future, and yet beneath that illusion, something is already breaking. Something invisible but undeniable. Something that begins not with armies or disasters, but with silence. The silence of truth being replaced. The silence of devotion fading into compromise. The silence that comes when people stop listening. And in the kingdom of Israel, that silence had grown so deep that it no longer felt like absence. It felt normal. It felt accepted. It felt like the new reality, because the people had not abandoned God openly. They had simply added something else beside him, something easier, something visible, something that promised results, and that something was Baal, a god of storm, of rain, of fertility, a god that seemed to offer control over the very things people feared losing, and under the rule of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, that worship was no longer hidden, it was promoted, protected, and normalized, woven into the identity of a nation that once stood for something entirely different. And the deeper the compromise grew, the quieter the truth became, until it seemed almost gone, until it seemed like no one would stand against it, no one would challenge it, no one would speak, and then, without warning, without introduction, without explanation, a man stepped into that silence, a man with no background given, no lineage announced, no credentials listed, only a name and a voice, and that name was Elijah. And when he spoke, he did not negotiate, he did not suggest, he declared that there would be no dew, no rain, not for days, not for weeks, but for years, except at his word. And in a land that depended entirely on rain for survival, that declaration was not just bold, it was unthinkable, because it struck at the very heart of what Baal was supposed to control. It challenged not only the people, but the false god they had come to trust. It exposed the illusion that had taken hold. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, Elijah was gone, hidden away, removed from sight, as if his purpose was not to remain visible, but to let the weight of his words unfold. And they did, slowly at first, then relentlessly. The skies closed, the land dried, the rivers shrank, the ground cracked under the pressure of absence, and what had once been taken for granted became something desperately needed. And as the drought deepened, so did the question. Who truly holds power? Who truly controls what cannot be forced, what cannot be manipulated, what cannot be produced by human effort? And while the nation struggled, Elijah was not standing in public view. He was hidden, led to a place where provision came in a way that defied expectation, where survival did not depend on the system that had failed, but on something greater, something unseen, ravens bringing food, water sustained beyond what should have been possible. A reminder that while the world around him was collapsing under the weight of its own misplaced trust, he was being sustained by something that did not fail, and yet even that provision shifted, because the brook dried up, because the drought did not stop for him, because the environment was affected completely, and he was sent again, not to a place of abundance, but to a widow in a foreign land, someone with almost nothing, someone preparing for what she believed would be her last meal. And into that moment of desperation, Elijah speaks again, not with apology, but with instruction, asking for what little she has, asking her to trust in something beyond her circumstance. And what follows is not immediate abundance, but sustained provision, day after day, just enough, never overflowing, but never failing. And in that process, something deeper is revealed. That provision is not always about excess. Sometimes it is about consistency, about trust built over time, about dependence that does not disappear when things become difficult. And then the story shifts again, because even in that place of provision, loss enters. The widow's son dies, and the question rises again, not just about survival, but about life itself, about whether the God Elijah represents has power beyond provision, beyond sustaining what remains, into restoring what has been lost. And Elijah responds not with distance, but with action, carrying the child, crying out, stretching himself over what appears lifeless. And in that moment, something happens that cannot be explained. Life returns, breath fills what was empty, and the reality becomes undeniable that the power at work is not limited, not partial, not dependent on circumstance, but complete, reaching into places where nothing else can reach, and the widow sees it, not as theory, but as truth revealed, declaring that now she knows, not because of words, but because of what has been witnessed, and all of this unfolds in silence from the perspective of the nation, while Ahab searches, while the land suffers, while the question grows louder without answer, until the time comes again for Elijah to step out of hiding, not to remain unseen, but to confront what has been building, because the drought was never the end, it was the beginning. It was the setup for something greater, something that would force a decision, not in private, but in front of everyone. Because the issue was never just about rain, it was about truth, about who God is, about whether the people would continue in compromise or return to what they had abandoned. And when Elijah returns, the tension reaches a point where it can no longer remain contained, because now the voice that had once spoken in isolation stands face to face with power, with authority, with a king who sees him not as a messenger, but as a problem, as the one who has troubled Israel. And Elijah does not deny it. He redirects it, exposing the real source of the trouble. Not the drought, not the declaration, but the abandonment of truth, the turning toward something that cannot answer, cannot provide, cannot save. And this moment begins to shift everything, because what was once hidden is now visible. What was once ignored is now unavoidable. And the stage is being set for a confrontation that will not only answer the question of reign, but the question of allegiance, the question of who is truly God. And as the story moves forward, the silence that once covered the land is about to be broken, not by argument, not by explanation, but by something far more undeniable, something that will leave no room for doubt. The drought had done more than dry the land. It had exposed the emptiness beneath everything the people had come to trust. It had stripped away the illusion of control, the confidence in systems that once felt secure, and left behind a question that could no longer be ignored: who truly holds power when everything else fails? And into that tension, into that uncertainty that had been building for years, Elijah stepped forward again, not hidden this time, not removed from sight, but standing directly in front of the very authority that had allowed the nation to drift. Standing before King Ahab, whose power could command armies but could not command the sky. And when Ahab saw him, the accusation came immediately, calling him the one who had troubled Israel, as if the drought itself were the problem, as if the silence of the heavens had no deeper cause. But Elijah did not accept that framing. He turned it back, exposing what had been ignored, that the trouble did not begin with him. It began with the abandonment of God, with the turning toward Baal, with the choice to trust in something that could not answer. And in that moment, the conflict that had been growing in the background was brought into the open, no longer hidden in quiet compromise, but placed at the center of the nation's attention. And Elijah did not call for discussion. He called for confrontation, not through argument, but through demonstration, a test that would settle the question once and for all, a challenge that would force a decision, because words had already failed. Tradition had already been twisted, belief had already been divided, and what remained was to reveal which God could actually respond. And so the call went out, gathering the people, bringing them to a single place, Mount Carmel, a mountain that would become the stage for one of the most defining moments in the history of Israel, where everything that had been hidden would be exposed, where the silence would be broken. And when the people assembled, Elijah did not begin with spectacle. He began with a question, one that cut through everything. How long will you go limping between two opinions? How long will you remain divided, holding on to both sides, trying to maintain belief while living in compromise? And the people did not answer, not because they had no thoughts, but because the question revealed something they did not want to face. That neutrality is not an option. That indecision is itself a decision. And Elijah moved forward, laying out the terms: simple, undeniable, two sides, two altars, two sacrifices, but no fire, because the fire would be the answer. The fire would reveal which God is real. And the prophets of Baal, hundreds of them, accepted the challenge, confident in numbers, confident in ritual, confident in the system they had practiced. And Elijah allowed them to go first, not rushing, not interrupting, giving them the full space to demonstrate what they believed. And they began, calling out, shouting, crying, from morning until noon, repeating the name of their God, seeking a response. seeking any sign that they were being heard, and the scene grew louder, more intense. As the hours passed, but nothing happened. No voice, no answer, no fire, only the echo of their own cries returning to them. And Elijah watched, not silently, but with a sharpness that exposed the reality of what was happening, suggesting that perhaps Baal was occupied, perhaps distracted, perhaps asleep, and the irony cut deeper than the words themselves, because it revealed the absurdity of a God that must be awakened, a God that must be persuaded, a God that depends on human effort to act. And the prophets responded by increasing their intensity, shouting louder, cutting themselves, pouring out everything they had into a system that demanded more but gave nothing in return. And still, nothing happened. The silence remained, unbroken, undeniable, exposing the truth not through argument, but through absence. And as the day moved on, as exhaustion began to replace energy, Elijah stepped forward, not in chaos, but in control, calling the people closer, drawing their attention not to noise, but to what he was about to do. And the first thing he did was rebuild, taking stones, 12 of them, representing the tribes of Israel, restoring something that had been broken, something that symbolized unity that had been lost, identity that had been divided. And he set the altar, not as something new, but as something restored, something that had been there before but had been abandoned. And then he prepared the sacrifice, placing it on the wood, arranging everything with precision. But he did something unexpected, something that removed any possibility of doubt. He poured water over it, not once, but multiple times, soaking the sacrifice, soaking the wood, filling a trench around the altar until everything was saturated, until any natural explanation was eliminated, until the situation itself declared that what would happen next could not be explained by chance. And then, in contrast to the chaos that had come before, Elijah spoke, not with volume, not with repetition, but with clarity, a simple prayer, calling on God not to prove something new, but to reveal what had always been true, to turn the hearts of the people back, to make it known that He alone is God. And in that moment, without delay, without build-up, the fire fell, not slowly, not partially, but completely, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the water, everything, leaving nothing untouched, nothing unclaimed. And the response was immediate. The people fell, not out of obligation, but out of realization, declaring what had become undeniable, that the Lord is God, not because they were told, but because they had seen, because the silence had been broken, because the question had been answered in a way that left no room for doubt. And in that moment, everything shifted, not gradually, but instantly, because truth, when revealed clearly, demands response. And Elijah moved quickly, not allowing the moment to fade, not allowing the clarity to be diluted, confronting the prophets of Baal, removing the influence that had led the people into compromise. And then, after everything that had happened, after the fire, after the declaration, after the confrontation, Elijah turned his attention back to the very thing that had begun it all, the drought. And he told Ahab to prepare, because the rain was coming, not as a possibility, but as a certainty. And Elijah went to the top of the mountain, not to perform, but to pray, bowing low, sending his servant to look toward the horizon, again and again, waiting, watching, until finally, a small cloud appeared, barely visible, insignificant at first glance, but carrying within it the answer. And Elijah knew, because what begins small does not remain small when it comes from God. And soon the sky darkened, the wind rose, the rain fell, breaking the drought, restoring what had been lost, not just physically, but spiritually, because the people had seen, the illusion had been shattered, the silence had been broken. And yet, even in victory, the story was not finished, because what happens after the fire is often more revealing than the fire itself, because power display does not always result in lasting change. And as the rain fell, as the land was restored, another chapter was about to begin, one that would reveal that even the strongest moments of faith can be followed by unexpected weakness, and that the story of Elijah was not just about power, but about what comes after it. The fire had fallen, the people had seen, the sky had broken open and rain returned to the land, and for a moment it seemed like everything had shifted, like the silence had been shattered permanently, like truth had reclaimed its place in a way that could not be undone. Because what had happened on Mount Carmel was not small. It was undeniable. It was overwhelming. It was the kind of moment that should have changed everything. The kind of moment that should have silenced opposition, ended compromise, restored what had been lost. And yet the story does not move in that direction. Because reality is often more complex than a single moment of clarity. Because even when truth is revealed powerfully, it does not automatically transform every heart. It does not erase resistance. It does not remove the influence of those who are determined to hold on to control. And that is where the tension rises again. Not from the people this time, but from the throne. Because when news of what happened reached Queen Jezebel, her response was not reflection, not surrender, not even hesitation. It was rage, immediate and absolute. A decision made without reconsideration, a vow spoken with certainty, that within a day, Elijah would be dead. And that threat did something unexpected, something that reveals a different side of Elijah. Because the man who had stood before hundreds, who had called down fire from heaven, who had faced a nation without fear, now ran, not toward confrontation, but away from it. Not because the threat was greater than what he had already faced, but because something within him had shifted. Something that cannot be measured by outward events alone. Something that reveals that even the strongest faith does not remove human vulnerability. And Elijah fled into the wilderness, leaving behind everything, moving into isolation, into silence again. But this time not as a place of preparation, but as a place of exhaustion. Because the victory on the mountain did not remove the weight he carried. It exposed it, it brought it to the surface. And as he went deeper into the wilderness, he reached a point where even movement felt like too much. Where he stopped, sat down, and spoke words that revealed the depth of what he was feeling. Not strength, not confidence, but weariness. Asking not for escape, but for an end. Saying that it was enough, that he could not continue, that the burden was too great. And in that moment, the story shifts completely. Because the prophet who had called down fire now lies under a tree, asking for death. And that contrast is not meant to confuse, it is meant to reveal. Because power does not remove pressure, and moments of victory do not eliminate the reality of what comes after. And Elijah falls asleep, not in peace, but in exhaustion. And when he wakes, it is not to a command, not to a rebuke, but to provision. Simple, quiet, almost unnoticed. Food and water placed beside him, not as a reward, but as a necessity. Because before anything else can be addressed, his physical need must be met. And this happens more than once, not rushed, not forced, but given in a way that allows him to recover, to regain enough strength to continue. And then he moves again, not toward a crowd, not toward a confrontation, but toward a mountain, toward a place of encounter, a place where he had to face not others, but himself, and ultimately God. And when he arrives, he enters a cave, a place of isolation, a place that reflects the state he is in. And there, the question comes, simple but direct. What are you doing here, Elijah? And his answer reveals what has been building beneath the surface. His sense of isolation, his belief that he alone remains, that everything he has done has not changed the outcome, that despite the fire, despite the rain, despite the confrontation, nothing has truly shifted, that he is still alone, still facing the same opposition, still carrying the same burden. And that perception, whether fully accurate or not, shapes how he sees everything. And God responds, not by arguing, not by correcting immediately, but by revealing himself in a way that Elijah does not expect. Because there is a wind, powerful, strong enough to tear through the mountain, but God is not in it. Then an earthquake, shaking the ground, but still, not there. Then fire, the very thing Elijah had called down before. And yet even that is not where God is revealed in this moment. And then, after all of it, comes something different. Something quiet. Something that could easily be missed. A still, small voice. Not overwhelming. Not forceful, but clear. And in that moment, Elijah recognizes it. Not because of volume, but because of presence. Because the power of God is not limited to spectacle. It is not confined to moments of display. It is also found in quiet, in stillness, in places where attention must shift from what is loud to what is real. And Elijah covers his face, stepping into that moment. And the question comes again, "What are you doing here?" And his answer remains the same, revealing that even after the encounter, his perception has not fully changed, that he still sees himself as alone, still believes that the situation has not shifted. And this is where the response moves from revelation to direction. Because God does not leave him in that place. He gives him instruction, specific, intentional, sending him back, not to the same position, but into a new phase of the story, telling him to anoint kings, to set in motion events that will reshape the nation, to continue the work not as an isolated figure, but as part of something larger, something that extends beyond his own effort. And then comes a statement that directly challenges his sense of isolation, revealing that he is not alone, that there are thousands who have not bowed, thousands who have remained faithful, unseen, unknown to him but present, and that changes the perspective completely. Because what he believed to be the end is not the end. What he saw as failure is not failure. It is part of a larger movement that he could not fully see. And then, within that instruction, something else is introduced. Something that shifts the story forward. The call of another. A man who would not replace Elijah immediately, but would walk alongside the unfolding of what had begun. A man named Elisha. And Elijah goes following the instruction, finding him not in a place of prominence, but in the middle of ordinary work, and without long explanation, without detailed introduction, he places his mantle on him, a symbolic act that carries weight, that signals a calling, a transfer not yet completed, but initiated. And Elisha responds, not casually, not partially, but decisively, leaving behind what he knew, stepping into something he could not fully understand. And in that moment, the story expands, no longer centered on one man alone, but moving towards something that will continue beyond him, something that will carry forward the same power, the same presence, but in a different way. And Elijah's journey, which had moved from confrontation to exhaustion, now shifts again into purpose, into continuation, into a path that is no longer about proving something, but about preparing what comes next. Because the fire on the mountain was not the end, it was a turning point. And what follows will reveal that the power of God does not rest on a single moment, or a single person, but continues, even when the one who carried it begins to step aside. The mountain had fallen silent, the fire had long since disappeared into memory, and yet the consequences of that moment continued to unfold, not always in the way one might expect, because the confrontation on Mount Carmel had revealed truth, but it had not erased resistance, it had exposed reality. But it had not removed opposition, and now the story moves into a quieter tension, one that unfolds not in dramatic spectacle, but in decisions, in power struggles, in the slow unraveling of a kingdom that had chosen compromise over truth. And at the center of it still stands Elijah, no longer isolated in the wilderness, no longer consumed by despair, but moving forward with renewed direction, carrying not just a message, but a mission that had been clearly defined. And alongside him now is someone who had once been unknown, someone pulled from ordinary life into something far greater. Elisha walking behind him, observing, learning, stepping into a role that had not yet fully taken shape, but was already beginning to form. And the presence of Elisha changes the dynamic. Because the story is no longer just about what Elijah does, it is about what is being passed on, what is being prepared, what will continue beyond the moment. And while this quiet transfer begins, the tension within the kingdom grows again, centered not only around worship, but around power, around authority, around the decisions of King Ahab, whose reign had already been marked by compromise, and now reveals something even deeper, a willingness to manipulate, to take what is not his, to act in ways that reflect not justice, but control. And the story narrows into a single event, something that might seem small compared to fire from heaven, but carries a different kind of weight, because it reveals the heart behind the throne. The story of Naboth and his vineyard, a piece of land that Ahab desired, not out of need, but out of convenience, something he wanted to convert into something else, something that would serve his purpose. And when Naboth refused, not out of defiance, but out of faithfulness to what had been entrusted to him, the king's response was not authority, but frustration, retreating into silence, into self-pity, revealing a weakness that had always been present beneath the surface. And into that weakness stepped Jezebel, not with hesitation, but with action, taking control of the situation, orchestrating a plan that would achieve what Ahab could not secure on his own, using deception, manipulation, false accusation, twisting justice into a tool for personal gain, and the result was as final as it was unjust. Naboth was killed, his voice silenced, his land taken, and the system that should have protected him became the instrument of his destruction. And in that moment, the corruption that had once been hidden behind religious compromise is now fully exposed in political power, showing that when truth is abandoned in one area, it does not remain contained, it spreads, it reshapes everything. And Elijah is sent again, not to a crowd, not to a mountain, but directly to the king, meeting him in the very place where the injustice had occurred, in the vineyard that had been taken, standing as a voice that cannot be ignored. And the confrontation is not loud, but it is absolute, declaring judgment, not as a possibility, but as a certainty, revealing that what has been done in secret is not hidden, that power does not remove accountability, that actions have consequences, and Ahab's response is different this time. Not defiance, but a moment of humility, a recognition of what has been spoken, and because of that, the outcome is delayed, not removed, but postponed, showing that even within judgment, there is space for response, that the story is not fixed in a single direction, but shaped by choices made along the way. And while this unfolds in the political sphere, something else continues quietly in the background. The relationship between Elijah and Elisha not defined by grand declarations, but by proximity, by presence, by the simple act of following. Because Elisha does not step into leadership immediately, he walks, he observes, he remains, and in that process, something is being formed, something that cannot be rushed, something that requires time, because what is being transferred is not just authority, it is understanding, it is experience, it is the weight of what it means to carry the presence of God in a world that resists it. And the story begins to move toward a transition, not announced, but approaching, something that Elijah seems to be aware of before others fully understand, because the journey they take begins to carry a different tone, moving from place to place, from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho, each step not random, but intentional, each location holding significance, each movement drawing closer to something that is about to happen. And along the way there are voices, groups of prophets who recognize what is coming, who speak to Elisha asking if he knows that his master will be taken from him, and his response is consistent, quiet but firm, that he knows, and yet he continues, refusing to step back, refusing to leave, even when Elijah tells him to stay behind, testing perhaps his commitment, or simply acknowledging the weight of what is ahead. And Elisha refuses every time, choosing to remain, choosing to stay close, because he understands that what is about to happen is not something to observe from a distance. It is something to witness directly, something that will define everything that follows. And as they move, the atmosphere shifts, not in chaos, but in anticipation, because the story is no longer building toward confrontation. It is building toward transition, toward a moment that will mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. And when they reach the Jordan, Elijah performs one final act that echoes what has come before, striking the water, parting it, creating a path where there should be none, and they cross together, not as teacher and student in the ordinary sense, but as two figures standing at the edge of something greater. And it is there that Elijah turns to Elisha and asks what he desires before he is taken. And the answer is not small, not cautious, but bold, asking for a double portion, not of power for its own sake, but of what Elijah carries, of the spirit that has defined his life. And Elijah does not dismiss the request, but he places a condition on it, that if Elisha sees him when he is taken, it will be granted. And that condition shifts everything, because it places the focus not on effort, but on presence, on being there, on witnessing what is about to unfold. And as they continue, walking, speaking, moving forward, the moment arrives, not gradually, but suddenly, with a force that cannot be contained, a chariot of fire, horses of fire, separating them, breaking the space between them, and Elijah is taken, not falling, not fading, but ascending, carried into something beyond what can be seen. And Elisha watches, not from a distance, but from within the moment, seeing it, experiencing it, crying out as it happens. And in that moment, everything changes, because the one who had carried the fire is gone, and what remains is not silence, but something else. Something falling back to the ground, something left behind, the mantle, and Elisha picks it up, not as a symbol alone, but as a reality, because what has been passed is not lost, it continues, and as he returns to the Jordan, standing where they had crossed together, he strikes the water, not with certainty, but with faith, asking where the God of Elijah is, and the water parts again, not as a repetition, but as confirmation, that the power has not ended, it has been transferred, that the story is not over, it is continuing, and what began with fire on a mountain now moves forward in a different form, carried by someone who once followed, but now must lead. The mantle had fallen, the fire had not disappeared, but it changed hands. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was waiting, because moments like this do not simply mark an ending, they test what comes next. They reveal whether what was seen can now be carried, whether what was witnessed can now be lived. And Elisha stood at that edge, no longer behind, no longer observing, but alone in a way that cannot be avoided when responsibility shifts, when the presence that once led from ahead is no longer visible. And the question now was no longer what Elijah could do, but what Elisha would do with what had been given. And that question was not answered in words, it was answered in action. In the moment he returned to the Jordan, holding the mantle, striking the water, not as a performance, but as a test of reality, asking where the God of Elijah is. And the answer came not in sound, but in movement. The water parted again, not as repetition, but as confirmation, that what had been carried by Elijah had not ended with him. It continued, it remained, it was now present with Elisha, and those who were watching, the sons of the prophets standing at a distance, saw it, not as a theory, but as evidence, recognizing that the spirit of Elijah now rested on Elisha. And yet even with that recognition, the transition was not immediate in every sense, because people often look backward before they fully accept what is now in front of them, and they urged Elisha to search for Elijah, to see if perhaps he had been taken somewhere else, somewhere hidden, somewhere still reachable, as if the departure could be reversed, as if the transition could be delayed. And Elisha resisted at first, knowing what they did not yet fully accept, but eventually allowed them to search. And for days they looked, and found nothing, and in that absence, the reality settled, that what had happened was final, that the story had moved forward, and that Elisha now stood in a place that could not be undone. And it is here that the nature of his calling begins to unfold, not in a single moment of fire, but in a series of moments that reveal something different. Because where Elijah had often stood in confrontation, Elisha would move in restoration. Where Elijah called down fire, Elisha would bring life. And the first sign of that shift appears in a place that seems ordinary, a city with a problem that had quietly persisted, water that was undrinkable, land that could not produce, a condition that affected everything but had no visible solution. And the people came to Elisha not with challenge, but with need. And he responded not with delay, but with action, taking salt, something simple, something ordinary, and casting it into the source of the water, declaring that it would be healed. And from that point forward, the water changed, not gradually, but completely. And what had once been unusable became life-giving. And that moment sets the tone for what follows. Because the power now at work is not less than before, it is expressed differently. Not in spectacle alone, but in transformation that touches daily life, that restores what has been broken, that changes what people depend on. And yet the story does not remain in comfort, because as Elisha moves forward, he encounters something else, something that reveals the tension that still exists, a group that does not see him as a carrier of what has been passed, but as something to be mocked, something to be dismissed. And their words are not harmless, they reflect a deeper resistance, a rejection of what he represents, and the response that follows is severe, not because of the insult alone, but because of what it reveals, that the presence of God is not something to be treated lightly, that what has been given carries weight, carries authority, carries consequence. And this moment stands as a reminder that the transition of power does not remove accountability. It establishes it in a new form. And from there, Elisha continues, moving through the land, not as a figure seeking recognition, but as one responding to need, and the next moment unfolds in the context of crisis. 3 kings facing defeat, an army without water, a situation that mirrors the drought that once defined Elijah's story, but approached from a different angle. Because now the question is not whether rain will fall, but whether provision will come in the midst of immediate danger. And they seek Elisha not because of who he was before, but because of what has been recognized in him now. And his response is measured, acknowledging the presence of those who do not seek God sincerely, yet choosing to act for the sake of what is needed, calling for music, creating a moment of stillness before speaking, and then declaring what will happen, that water will fill the valley without wind, without rain, without visible cause, and it does, appearing in a way that cannot be explained, sustaining an army that would have otherwise failed, and even turning the situation against their enemies, who misinterpret what they see and are overcome by their own assumptions. And in this, the pattern becomes clear, that the power now at work is not limited to one form. It moves in different ways, in quiet provision, in unexpected outcomes, in moments that do not always announce themselves loudly but carry the same authority. And then the story narrows again, moving from kings to a single woman, a widow in debt, facing the loss of her sons, not through death but through slavery, a different kind of loss, one that unfolds slowly, one that removes future rather than present. And she comes to Elisha with nothing but a plea, and his response begins with a question. What do you have? Not to dismiss her need, but to reveal what remains. And she answers, almost dismissively, that she has only a small jar of oil, something insignificant, something that would not normally be seen as a solution. And yet that is where the answer begins, because what follows is not the introduction of something new, but the multiplication of what already exists, as she is told to gather vessels, not a few, to prepare for something she cannot yet see. And as she pours, the oil continues, filling every container, stopping only when there is no more space. And in that moment, the crisis is reversed. Debt is paid, future is restored, not through excess given instantly, but through provision that flows as long as there is room to receive it. And this pattern continues, moving from one situation to another, each one revealing a different aspect of what has been entrusted to Elisha, until it reaches a moment that echoes something deeper, something that connects back to what Elijah once did, but now carried forward in a new way, the story of a child, a promise given to a woman who had none, a life that arrives unexpectedly, and then just as unexpectedly, is taken. And the grief that follows is not quiet. It is urgent, it moves, it seeks, it refuses to accept the finality of what has happened. And she goes to Elisha, not with explanation, but with determination, and he responds, sending his servant ahead. But when that does not change the outcome, he goes himself, entering the room, closing the door, stepping into the space where death seems to have settled, and there, once again, something happens that cannot be explained by effort alone. Life returns, not instantly but through persistence, through presence, through a process that reflects both power and intention. And the child breathes again, and in that moment, the pattern that began with Elijah is not just repeated. It is expanded, carried forward, showing that what was once seen is now continuing, not as imitation but as extension. And the story of Elisha is no longer a question of whether he carries what Elijah had. It is a demonstration that the same power now moves through him in ways that reach further, touch deeper, and continue to unfold, because the mantle was never meant to fall and remain still. It was meant to be picked up, to be carried, to be lived out, and what has begun here is only the beginning of what will follow. The pattern had been established, not through a single moment, but through a growing series of events that revealed something deeper each time. That the power now at work through Elisha was not limited to dramatic displays alone. It moved into the ordinary, into the overlooked, into the kinds of situations that most would not expect to carry significance. And yet within those moments, something continued to unfold that made it impossible to ignore, because what had once been carried by Elijah had not diminished. It had expanded. It had taken on a different rhythm, a different expression, one that reached further into the daily lives of people rather than remaining at the level of national confrontation. And this shift becomes even more visible as the story moves into encounters that are quieter on the surface, yet no less powerful in what they reveal, because the presence of God does not always announce itself with fire. Sometimes it works in ways that are almost hidden until the outcome makes it undeniable. And one of those moments unfolds in a place of danger disguised as normalcy, a group of prophets sitting down to eat, unaware that what had been prepared carried death within it, a pot filled with something poisonous, something that would bring harm instead of nourishment, and the realization comes too late. The cry rises, acknowledging that what should sustain has now become a threat, and Elisha responds not with panic, but with action, taking something simple, flour, and casting it into the pot. And what was harmful becomes harmless, what carried death becomes safe. And the meal continues, and in that moment, the pattern is reinforced again. That transformation does not always come through removing what is wrong. Sometimes it comes through changing it, through intervening in a way that restores rather than replaces, and the story continues to move, shifting again into provision. Into a moment where need meets limitation, where a group is faced with too little to satisfy too many. A small offering placed before Elisha, not enough by any natural calculation, and yet he instructs that it be given, not divided carefully, not rationed, but distributed. And what follows defies expectation, because the amount does not determine the outcome. The source does, and there is more than enough, not just barely sufficient, but with excess remaining. And again, the pattern holds, that what is placed in the hands of God does not remain as it was. It becomes something more, something that exceeds the limits it once carried. And then the story moves into a moment that reaches beyond Israel, beyond the familiar boundaries, into the life of a man whose power is not spiritual but political, military. A commander named Naaman, a man of authority, a man respected, a man successful in every visible way, and yet carrying something that undermines all of it, a disease that cannot be hidden forever, something that places a limit on his strength, something that reminds him that control is never complete. And through an unlikely chain of events, through the voice of a servant, through the connection of a foreign land, he hears of Elisha and the possibility that what cannot be solved where he stands might be addressed somewhere else. And so he comes, not quietly, but with expectation, with resources, with the assumption that what he brings will influence the outcome, that his position will shape the response, and yet what he encounters is not what he expects. Because Elisha does not come out to meet him, does not engage in the display that Naaman anticipates, instead sending a message, simple, direct, almost offensive in its simplicity, to wash in the Jordan, to do something that appears beneath him, something that does not align with his status, his understanding, his expectation of how power should work, and his reaction reveals the deeper struggle, not with the instruction itself, but with what it represents. That healing would come not through what he brings, not through what he is, but through obedience to something that does not elevate him. And he turns away at first, offended, resistant, until those around him speak, not with authority, but with reason, pointing out that if something difficult had been required, he would have done it, and so why reject something simple? And that moment becomes the turning point, because it exposes that the barrier was never the action, it was pride, it was expectation, it was the belief that power must align with what feels significant. And Naaman returns, not with confidence, but with willingness, stepping into the water, not once but repeatedly, following the instruction fully. And the result is not gradual, it is complete, restoration that goes beyond what he expected, beyond what he had known before. And in that moment, something shifts within him, not just physically, but internally, recognizing that what has happened cannot be attributed to anything he brought, anything he controlled, anything he deserved. And he returns, offering what he had brought, seeking to respond in a way that matches what he has received. But Elisha refuses, not because the gift itself is wrong, but because what has been given cannot be purchased, cannot be exchanged, cannot be reduced to transaction. And this moment becomes a defining contrast, not just for now, but for those watching, because immediately after, another response emerges, not from an outsider, but from within, from someone who has seen what happened, who understands the situation, and yet chooses differently. driven by desire, by the pull of gain, by the opportunity to take what was not given, and that decision leads to consequence, not delayed, not hidden, but immediate, revealing again that the presence of God is not something to be manipulated, not something to be used for personal benefit. And as the story continues, the reach of Elisha's influence extends further, even into matters of national security, into moments where plans are exposed, where movements are revealed before they happen, where what is hidden becomes known, not through strategy, but through revelation. And this creates tension beyond individuals, beyond isolated events. BECAUSE. Now the power at work is seen as a threat by those who cannot control it, by those who cannot predict it, by those who see it not as truth but as opposition. And this leads to a moment where Elisha himself becomes the target, surrounded, outnumbered, placed in a position where escape seems impossible. And yet even in that moment, the reality of what is unseen becomes visible, not to all, but to one who is allowed to see, revealing that the forces present are not limited to what can be counted, not confined to what appears overwhelming, and fear is replaced with clarity. Not because the situation has changed, but because the understanding of it has, and Elisha remains unmoved. Not because there is no danger, but because he sees beyond it, and what follows is not destruction, but confusion among those who came against him, blindness that removes their advantage, leading them not into victory, but into vulnerability. And once again, the pattern holds, that power is not always expressed through force, but through control of what others cannot see. And as these moments continue to unfold, the story builds towards something greater. Not a single event, but a growing recognition that what has been entrusted to Elisha is not limited by circumstance, not confined by expectation, but continues to move, to act, to reveal, in ways that challenge every assumption about how power works, because it does not follow the patterns people expect, it does not respond to status, it does not operate according to human systems, it moves according to something deeper, something that cannot be controlled, only received. And those who encounter it are left with the same question again and again, not what just happened, but who is behind it. Because the answer to that question changes everything. The tension had been building not only in isolated moments but across the land itself, because the influence of Elisha was no longer confined to private encounters or individual needs. It had begun to intersect with the movements of nations, with the decisions of kings, with conflicts that shaped the future of entire regions. And when something that cannot be controlled begins to influence what people believe they control, resistance is no longer subtle. It becomes direct, it becomes strategic, it becomes determined, and that is exactly what unfolded as the king of Aram found his plans repeatedly exposed, his movements anticipated, his advantage removed before it could even be used. And the question that rose within his camp was not whether something was wrong, but who was responsible. Because when outcomes begin to defy expectation consistently, suspicion follows. And at first the suspicion turned inward, toward betrayal, toward the idea that someone within his own ranks was revealing his plans. And yet the truth was more unsettling than betrayal, because it could not be contained, it could not be silenced, it could not be eliminated through normal means. It was the presence of God revealing what was hidden through the life of Elisha, making known what was spoken in secret, turning strategy into exposure. And when the source was identified, the response was immediate, not to understand, but to eliminate, because what cannot be controlled is often seen as a threat that must be removed. And so the order was given to find him, to locate him, to surround him, to ensure that what had disrupted their plans would no longer stand in their way. And the moment arrives quietly, almost unexpectedly, as the city where Elisha was staying was surrounded during the night, an army positioned, ready, overwhelming by every visible measure. And when morning came, it was not Elisha who first saw the reality of the situation. It was his servant, stepping outside, seeing what no one would want to see, an entire force positioned against them, escape impossible, outcome seemingly certain, and fear rose immediately, not as weakness, but as a natural response to what appeared undeniable. And he returned with urgency, with panic, with the question that follows every moment of crisis: what are we going to do? And Elisha's response did not match the situation as it appeared, because he did not begin with strategy. He did not call for escape. He did not react to what was visible. Instead, he spoke with a calm that seemed disconnected from reality, saying that those who are with us are more than those who are with them, and that statement, in that moment, did not make sense, not from what could be seen, not from what could be counted. And so Elisha did something that shifted everything, not externally at first, but internally. He prayed, not for the situation to change, but for perception to change, asking that his servant's eyes be opened, and in that moment, the unseen became visible. The reality that had always been present but had not been perceived suddenly revealed. The hills filled with something greater than the army that surrounded them, a presence that could not be measured by numbers, a force that did not depend on position or strategy, and fear was replaced, not because the enemy disappeared, but because the understanding of the situation had changed completely. And this moment reveals something fundamental. That reality is not always defined by what is immediately visible, that what is unseen can be more decisive than what is seen. And as the enemy advanced, as the threat moved closer, Elisha did not retreat. He did not call for destruction. Instead, he prayed again, but this time not for revelation, but for confusion, for blindness to fall upon those who had come against him. And it did, not removing them, but removing their ability to act effectively, leading them into a state where they could be guided, redirected, brought into a place they did not intend to go. And Elisha led them, not into destruction, but into the very center of the city they sought to oppose, into Samaria, where their vulnerability became clear. And once again, the expected outcome was overturned, because the king of Israel saw opportunity, saw advantage, saw a chance to eliminate those who had come against them. And he asked what should be done, expecting permission to act, expecting confirmation to strike. But Elisha's response did not align with that expectation, because the power at work was not about retaliation. It was not about mirroring the actions of the enemy. It was about revealing something different, something that breaks the cycle rather than continuing it. And he instructed that they be fed, that they be given water, that they be sent away. And this decision did more than spare lives. It disrupted the pattern of conflict. It introduced something that could not be anticipated, could not be countered with force. And for a time the raid ceased, not because the threat had been eliminated permanently, but because the response had changed the dynamic, showing that power expressed through restraint can be more decisive than power expressed through destruction. And yet the tension did not disappear entirely, because what cannot be controlled does not stop being seen as a threat. And the story moves again into a darker moment, a siege that brings the city to desperation, a condition so severe that survival itself becomes uncertain, where hunger replaces strength, where choices become unthinkable, where the pressure of circumstance reveals the depth of what people will do when pushed beyond limit. And in that moment, blame rises again, directed toward Elisha, not because he caused the situation, but because he represents the presence of God. And when suffering increases, people often look for someone to hold responsible. And the king's response reflects that, turning toward anger, toward reaction, toward the desire to remove what he does not understand. And yet, even in that moment, Elisha speaks with certainty, declaring that the situation will change, that provision will come, not gradually, but suddenly. And the words are met with disbelief, because when circumstances reach extreme levels, hope becomes difficult to accept, and yet the pattern holds. Because what seems impossible does not remain impossible when God acts. And through a series of events that no one could have predicted, the enemy flees, leaving behind everything, turning abundance into reality overnight, and the city is restored, not through effort, not through negotiation, but through a shift that no one could control. And in all of this, the role of Elisha becomes clearer. Not as someone who controls outcomes, but as someone who stands in alignment with the one who does, who speaks what is given, who acts when directed, who remains steady when everything else moves unpredictably. And this steadiness becomes the defining mark of his life, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of clarity within it, not the removal of difficulty, but the ability to stand within it without being shaped by it. And as the story continues to move forward, the weight of what he carries becomes even more evident, because what has been entrusted to him is not just for moments, it is for a lifetime, a calling that does not fade with time, but continues to unfold, revealing again and again that the power of God is not limited by circumstance, not restricted by opposition, but moves through those who are willing to trust, even when what they see does not yet match what has been spoken. Time had moved forward, not in sudden leaps of spectacle, but in steady progression, and with it, the weight of what Elisha carried did not diminish. It deepened, because calling is not proven in a single moment. It is revealed over time, through consistency, through endurance, through the ability to remain aligned when everything around begins to shift. And the world around him was shifting again, not quietly, but through upheaval, through change in leadership, through the rise and fall of kings. Because the influence of God's voice does not remain separate from history, it moves within it, shaping outcomes in ways that are not always immediately recognized. And in this phase of the story, Elisha is no longer simply responding to events. He is positioned within them, speaking into the future before it unfolds. And one of the most striking moments of this comes when a man approaches him, not as a seeker of healing, not as someone in immediate need, but as a messenger, representing power, representing authority, sent by a king whose life is nearing its end. And the question brought before Elisha is simple on the surface. Will the king recover? But beneath that question lies something deeper, because the answer is not only about health, it is about succession, about what comes next, about who will rise when one falls. And Elisha responds in a way that seems contradictory at first, saying that the king will recover, and yet revealing that he will die, not from the illness but through something else, something that has not yet happened. And then the moment shifts into something heavier, something that carries a different kind of weight, as Elisha begins to look intently at the man before him, a gaze that goes beyond the present, beyond the visible, into what will be, into actions not yet taken, into consequences not yet realized. And the silence that follows is not empty, it is filled with what is being seen, until Elisha begins to weep, not for what is, but for what will happen, for the destruction that this man will bring, for the suffering that will unfold through his actions. And when questioned, he speaks plainly, revealing what lies ahead: violence, devastation, acts that will shape the future of nations. And the man responds with disbelief, rejecting the possibility that he could become what is being described, because people often do not recognize what they are capable of before they are placed in the position to act. And yet the words spoken do not change, because they are not based on assumption, they are based on revelation. And the story moves forward to confirm what was said, as events unfold exactly as described, showing that the future, though unseen, is not unknown to God. And Elisha stands as one who sees beyond the moment, not to control it, but to declare it. And as time continues, another transition begins to take shape, not immediate, but approaching, because even a life as significant as Elisha's moves toward an end. And as that reality draws closer, the focus shifts again, not away from power, but toward legacy, toward what remains when the one who carried it is no longer present. And the king of Israel comes to him, not with authority, but with recognition, echoing words once spoken before, acknowledging the role Elisha has played, the protection he has been for the nation. And Elisha responds not with finality, but with action, instructing the king in a way that seems symbolic, yet carries real consequence, involving a bow, arrows, an act that represents what is about to happen, what will unfold in the battles ahead. And the king follows, but not fully, not with the persistence that is required, stopping short of what was instructed. And in that moment, something is revealed again. That partial obedience leads to partial outcome, that what is possible is not always fully realized when commitment is incomplete. And Elisha makes this clear, not out of frustration alone, but to reveal that what could have been achieved has now been limited, not by God, but by the response of the one involved. And this moment becomes a reflection of something larger, that the power of God does not remove human responsibility, it invites it, it works through it, and the outcome is shaped by how fully that invitation is embraced. And then the story reaches a moment that feels like an ending, because Elisha becomes ill, the strength that had defined his life begins to fade. And the one who had stood through so many moments now faces the same reality every person does, the limit of time, the approach of death. And yet even in that moment, The presence that had defined his life does not disappear. It remains. It continues to act, to influence, to move, even as his own life comes to its conclusion. And when he dies, it is not marked by fire from heaven, not by a chariot of fire as with Elijah, but by something quieter, something that could easily be overlooked. And yet, what follows reveals that the story is not finished. Because sometime later, in a moment of urgency, in a situation that has nothing to do with Elisha directly, a group of men are burying someone, and as they do, they encounter danger, forcing them to act quickly, to place the body in the nearest place available, which happens to be the tomb of Elisha. And in that unexpected moment, something happens that defies every expectation. The moment the body touches his bones, life returns, not gradually, not symbolically, but physically, completely. And the man stands, alive again. And this moment, though brief, carries a weight that cannot be ignored, because it reveals something that goes beyond the life of the prophet himself, that the power that moved through him was not limited to his presence, not confined to his voice, not dependent on his continued activity. It remained, it lingered, it continued to act even after his death. And this becomes the final confirmation of what had been unfolding all along, that what was passed from Elijah to Elisha was never meant to end with either of them. It was part of something larger, something that continues beyond individuals, beyond moments, beyond lifetimes. And as the story reaches this point, it leaves behind not just a record of what happened, but a reflection of what it means to carry something that is not your own, to live in alignment with something greater, to be part of a story that does not begin or end with you, but moves through you and continues after you are gone. The story does not end with silence, even though both Elijah and Elisha are no longer walking the earth, because what they carried was never meant to be confined to their lifetimes. It was never meant to exist only in moments of fire or miracles. It was something deeper, something that moved through them but did not belong to them. And that is why, even after their departure, the impact of their lives continues to echo, not just in the events that followed, but in the pattern they revealed. A pattern that reshapes how power is understood, how faith is lived, how truth stands in a world that constantly drifts away from it. Because if there is one thing their story makes undeniable, it is that the presence of God does not disappear when circumstances change. It does not weaken when opposition rises. It does not end when the one carrying it is gone. It continues, it moves, it finds new vessels, new moments, new ways to reveal itself. And that continuity is what gives their story its weight. Because it is not just about what happened then, it is about what it means now. It is about what remains when the fire fades and the voice grows quiet. It is about whether what was seen can still be trusted when it is no longer visible in the same way. And this is where the story becomes personal, because the same tension that existed then still exists now. The tension between control and surrender, between effort and trust, between what can be measured and what must be believed. And in that tension, the lives of Elijah and Elisha stand as a reflection, not of perfection, but of alignment, of individuals who stepped into something greater than themselves, who carried it through moments of confrontation and moments of quiet, through victory and through exhaustion, through clarity and through uncertainty. And in doing so, revealed that faith is not defined by a single moment. It is defined by continuity, by the willingness to remain even when the environment shifts, even when the outcome is not immediate, even when the next step is not fully visible. And that is where their legacy truly lives, not in the fire itself, not in the miracles alone, but in the persistence of what they carried, in the fact that the power did not stop. It was passed on, and even beyond Elisha, even beyond the moment where life returned at the touch of his bones, the story points forward to something greater, something that would one day redefine everything they had experienced. Because the pattern of passing, of continuation, of presence moving from one to another, was never the final form. It was preparation. It was pointing toward a time when the presence of God would not rest on a single prophet, or be carried by a chosen few, but would be made available in a way that could not be limited, would not be contained, could not be transferred from one person to another, because it would be given freely, fully, completely. And in that future, the fire would not fall on an altar, it would rest within people. The voice would not come from a distance, It would speak from within, and the question would no longer be who carries it, but whether it is received. And this is where the story shifts from history to invitation, because everything that has been shown is not just to be observed, it is to be considered, to be responded to be lived, because the same God who answered by fire, who provided in drought, who revealed what was hidden, who restored what was lost, who continued beyond death, is not confined to the past, not limited to the pages of history, not restricted to the lives of Elijah and Elisha, but remains the same in power, the same in presence, the same in preface. And the question that remains is not whether he still works, but whether people still listen, whether they still trust, whether they are still willing to step into what they cannot control, to follow what they do not fully understand, to carry what does not originate from them. And that question does not demand a quick answer, but it does demand an honest one, because the choice is not between belief and unbelief alone. It is between living as though the story is over or living as though it continues, between treating what has been seen as something distant or as something that still shapes reality now. And that is where everything comes together, because the legacy of Elijah and Elisha is not preserved in memory alone, it is preserved in movement, in continuation, in the reality that what began before them and moved through them did not end with them, and will not end at all. And so the story closes not with finality, but with an open space, a space where the past meets the present, where what has been revealed meets what is still unfolding, where the fire that once fell becomes the question that remains: what will you do with it? Fire fell from heaven, a prophet was taken into the sky, and power continued, even after death. So here's the question: do you believe that kind of power still exists today? Comment below, fire or double subscribe for more dark cinematic Bible stories, and watch the next video, because some stories don't end, they continue through you.